This is a repeating pattern I have noticed ever since I started living in apartments. In my very first apartment in the year 2000, I had just moved away from home and I was living with my new husband. There was an elderly woman that lived in the same complex. From our patio, we could see her watering her flowers. After living there for about a year, we heard this huge commotion outside. There were fire trucks, sirens, and we could hear screaming. When we looked outside, we could see the fire department trying to break into the same unit the weird old lady lived in. She had called 911 and barricaded herself inside. They informed her that they could not leave until they cleared the apartment. We could hear screaming, "No, I will not open it. Leave now," over and over. Eventually, the office manager came down and said that she would open the door with her key, because the firemen were starting to go at the front door with an axe to get in. I can still see the leasing manager opening the door and quickly running backwards to let the firemen in. Once they were inside, they were able to clear the unit quite quickly. There was no fire, and the old woman refused to give an explanation as to why she called for help, and then locked herself inside, so we kinda just shrugged it off. We had only lived in this apartment for about 2 years. In that time, we discovered that the flowers she had taken such good care of on her deck, they were indeed plastic. She had them in a pot with dirt and wrapped them around a fence, but when we noticed that she had blooms in the middle of winter, I went and walked by her unit and noticed that they had been glued and placed there. They were faded, but she kept the dirt in the pot wet. When we finally decided to move, we had relatives in and out of the apartment. They were helping us load stuff up and take boxes down to the truck. My sister-in-law asked who the old lady outside was. Thinking nothing of it, I said, "Who? What old lady?" And I went outside to take a look. The old woman from the other unit was standing out in the middle of the road. She was wearing nothing but a house dress, bare feet, messy unkempt hair. She had a blank stare. I tried not to think anything of it, mostly just tried to ignore her. People moved in and out of the complex every day, and she had never done this. She wanted to know where we were going and why. I kept my responses short and simple, but she looked concerned, even worried. The last thing I remember is us packing up the last of our furniture just before dark. She was still standing there, alone, in the middle of the road with that blank stare, watching the moving truck leave. Now, I'm not a superstitious person per se, but for whatever reason, the next few years of our lives were a downward spiral. Relatives dying, losing my job, things like that. Basically, the next 2 years in our next apartment sucked. So we got out of there and moved into our third apartment. Third time's the charm, right? As if all of that wasn't weird before, here's where it gets really weird. One day, I'm out walking my dog, and way off in the distance, I see an old lady. In a little house dress, she walks out of one of the units and slowly walks into the middle of the road. The whole time, I could swear she sees me and is looking right at me. It actually gave me chills, but I told myself, this lady is far away, on the other side of the tennis court, and there's no way she can see me. But I was wrong. I was so weirded out by the fact that there was no one else around. In the middle of this nice spring afternoon, I almost turned around and backtracked just to get away, but I told myself I was being paranoid, and again, there's no way this woman could be looking at me. So I kept going. I got up onto the road at this point, and I tried acting like there wasn't someone standing there alone in the middle of the road watching me. I tried to walk around her, and she just starts talking. As I'm quickly trying to walk away, she doesn't even address me, just, "Is that your dog? I haven't seen you. Where do you live?" So I'm thinking, this lady has to be nuts, off of her meds or something. I just start walking faster. I figure maybe she doesn't like dogs. I have had a few people complain that they don't like animals, so I just shrug it off, keep moving. I can still hear her talking behind me after we had walked well past her. Something about dogs. I was never able to get that image of that woman out of my head. And even weirder, we go back to that park every day. Never saw her or anyone matching that description again. Less than a year later, our dog died. He got sick around the same time we saw her. I again lost my job for a different reason this time, but the timing was the same, and we again had a death in the family. So now, my question is this. Is it possible to see an entity related to bad times coming, or is she the entity of something that can cause a curse? I know it sounds ridiculous. I know it couldn't have been the same old lady, but I can't help but wonder. This all started when I was 9 years old. At the time, I attended a small Christian school with fewer than 100 students across 10 grade levels. For our annual school camp, years 4 to 6 went to Barrie Sport and Recreation Center for 2 nights. I was excited but nervous at the same time. This was 4 hours from home, and I had never been away from my mom without an older relative. Thankfully, my sister, just a year older than me, was also attending. After arriving and getting settled, I felt an unfamiliar sensation in my chest. After lunch, we socialized with students from the other schools. That evening, after dinner and some of the night games, we returned to our cabins, which were more secluded than the other students' accommodations. All of the girls in my cabin talked about how the place felt eerie. When the lights went out, I saw a tall shadow in the doorway. Terrified, I moved to another girl's bed in the next section. I eventually fell asleep until I woke to a woman's voice calling for Max and Luke, reassuring them it was safe to come home. I barely slept after that. The next night, we left our cabin tidy before heading to the gym for night games. When we returned, everything was trashed, items thrown around, lights left on, nothing was as we left it. Suddenly screams rang out, "Demon, it's a demon," followed by crying. Teachers rushed in to console us. No one slept that night either. On the bus ride home, I was filled with fear, and a little curiosity. What had we encountered that night? What trashed our room? And who or what did I see standing in the doorway? Even weeks later, I felt uneasy and I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Then small things started happening at home. A door rattling with no draft, footsteps when no one was awake. Soon, it escalated. My family, believers and skeptics alike, we witnessed unexplainable events. We heard children running up and down the stairs, and twice a clock jumped off the wall at my mother. My guitar strummed itself, but the worst part, whatever it was, is focused on me. My bedroom was downstairs, near the front door. I heard tapping on my windows, scratching on the walls, footsteps on the gravel outside where no one could have been. Banging on the front door would wake me in the middle of the night. But the sleep paralysis, that was the worst. I woke up between 3 and 4 a.m. almost every single night, unable to move, often feeling a presence sitting on my bed. One morning I woke up to find my door unlocked and wide open. I know I had not touched it, and no one came in or out that night. When I turned 11, we moved into a new place and everything seemed fine at first. But that didn't last very long. Strange things began happening again. My sister's bathroom was connected to my room. I would see her walk in, but never leave. I heard the shower run, but I know there was no one in there. When I asked her, she was confused and she said that she hadn't been in the room. A few months later, we moved again and all activity stopped, for good this time. Years later, and still unable to get the images of what had happened out of my head, curiosity led me to research the Barrie Sports and Recreational Center. What I found was shocking. It had once been a home for misbehaved boys, where they were beaten, some potentially fatal, and the cabin that I had stayed in was the punishment room. Eventually, I was able to track down and reconnect with some of the girls that stayed in the cabin with me. They told me about similar, terrifying experiences that had happened to them. I still wonder why I formed an attachment and what it wanted from me. Was it just a sad little boy that wanted help, or was it something much more dark and twisted? Either way, it's been years now and nothing has happened. One thing's for sure though, I won't forget the 2 nights that I spent at the Barrie Sports and Recreation Center. Those 2 nights sparked a lifelong fascination with the paranormal. When my mother was pregnant with me, she and my father bought a house in very rural East Germany. My father was in an accident which caused him not to be able to work anymore, and my mother worked in a psychiatric hospital about an hour away. My father was always left alone in the house, and he hated it. He would always tell my mother about how he could hear voices and footsteps. Things would move on their own around the house, the TV would change channels, and so on and so on. My mother always thought it was because of his medications. He was on some pretty heavy-duty pain medications due to his accident. So her go-to was always, "No, you're just stressed or tired," since that was the same thing that she told herself and continues to tell herself to this day. When I was born, my father was terrified to let me sleep alone because my nursery was in the attic. So because of this, I would always stay in their room and my mother would be furious when she got home the next morning. His excuse was always that I'd had night terrors or a bad dream, and since my mother worked the night shift, she was never home to prove him wrong. The house creeped him out so much that the second I was able to be put into school, I started kindergarten at 9 months old. The first memories I have of this house are no different. I have heard the voices of men's coughing and heavy footsteps. I didn't have the same problem my father did. I didn't think that they were scary for some reason. At some point, my mother got cut down on night shifts, so she was home a lot more, which means I had to sleep in the attic. No more excuses. It was much louder up there, and I had similar experiences to my father. My TV would switch channels on its own. My VHS player would act up as well, which wasn't all that weird because I was used to it and thought that they all just did that, although my DVD player did the same. I had drapes in front of my bed that would move every night next to the armchair that my mother had put there. I had one plushie that kept falling off of the shelf. No matter what I did, it would always end up on the floor, and I started having really weird dreams, always of men, grown men, a Russian soldier, and two other random men that I could never put into a category. They didn't stand out to me all that much. My dreams were really weird. I had no idea who these men were, and they would just be normal, not doing anything in particular, not threatening, they were just there. I was so young that I didn't know that our house was located in the middle of a village for Russian soldiers in the German Democratic Republic, and once the GDR was gone, the Russian soldiers all left, and Germans would all move into the village and buy the houses that the Russians left behind. At this point now, the dreams were ramping up. The men were speaking to me. They introduced themselves. They had told me that their names were Sasha, Heinrich, and Max. It's almost like they were looking out for me. Sasha and Max would always tell me never to go into the woods alone. I didn't question it. Why would I? I was 4, and my neighbors would always watch me when my father was in the hospital and my mother was at work after hours when the kindergarten was closed. All 3 of the men in my dreams would also tell me never to talk to certain neighbors, which were basically everyone except for the ones that watched me regularly. Once again, why question it? I'm 4. What do I know? At some point down the road, my mother still wasn't convinced that I was experiencing the same things as my father, so she would question us separately. I told her about the men, I described them, told her what their names were, and how that they would speak to me and look out for me. She would always brush it off until one day she couldn't deny it anymore. We were going to our hidden beach, a beach that can't even be found on Google Maps. To this day, it still belongs to the military base next to our house. I had never been there, but I heard stories. My mother couldn't believe it when I told her that I knew a shortcut to this beach. How, she said, you've never been there. So I proved it to her. I grabbed her by the hand, led her through the forest, showed her exactly where and where we could not step due to all the landmines from the active military base. We never stepped on any, and funny thing, I didn't see one explode until I was 12, but that's another story. A few minutes later, we found the clearing to the beach, and she couldn't believe her eyes. She couldn't believe that I knew such a shortcut. How, she asked. I just shrugged and told her, Sasha told me. Now at this point, it was undeniable, and she did some research. Sasha was the first name to pop up. He was the first officer who lived there and had a heart attack. Both Max and Heinrich were not in the military. They were just normal people, but sadly had passed away in the house. Heinrich was very old when he passed away, but as for Max, she had to do some digging. There wasn't much about him, but apparently he was the owner before us, and he had hung himself in the house. And at that point, that's where my mother really left it. Years passed, and they would continue to visit me in my dreams. They even warned me about when my father was about to pass. So after my father was gone, I moved into his room, then the dream stopped altogether. Then the whole tone of the house just shifted. I went from the attic feeling protected and okay to moving into my father's room and feeling like something was watching me. I told myself that I was being paranoid or that I was just grieving the loss of my father. Either way, I tried to convince myself that there was nothing there. But then the footsteps began again. Not the same footsteps that I had been used to for years, but they were different. Like someone was stomping around and they were very angry, looking for something. Eventually, the footsteps would get closer and closer to my room, until one night they walked right up to my bed and I heard voices whispering in my ear. Not loud enough to know what was being said, just like muffled whispers. I had convinced myself that it was just a dream. Fast forward a few more years, I had friends over and we both decided to go up and stay in the attic. We watched Harry Potter up there because my old 80s TV had a DVD player attached to it. When all of a sudden, the TV just turns off. Huh, faulty wiring, I said, not trying to freak my friend out. Then the light turns off. Maybe the light switch wasn't fully flicked on, I said. Then the TV turned back on. But it wasn't Harry Potter, it was a random VHS. One from when I was a toddler, that I'd honestly forgot I'd even had. As I was standing in front of the TV trying to fix the DVD player, my friend and I kept talking until she suddenly got quiet and then called my name while staring at the direction of the door. There's a mirror on the chimney that I covered. I spray painted it when I was a kid because mirrors are creepy and they freak me out. What? I asked. I swear there's someone standing over there, she replied. Where? You're seeing things, I said. No, I'm not. That's a Russian, she screamed. Very funny, I giggled as I replied. I literally thought she was kidding because she always called me Russian as a nickname. I was the only Russian kid in our elementary school, so my head flicked to that. Look, he's staring right at us, she exclaimed. Now I got a little creeped out and slowly turned around to look. There's nothing there. You see someone, I said. Yeah, she screamed. How do you know he's Russian? 'Cause of the uniform. You see him? Wait, uniform? I said confusingly. How can you see my imaginary friends? Turns out they're not imaginary after all, huh? Sasha, go away, I said jokingly. Then my friend looked at me. Her face went pale. She grabbed her things and straight up took off, sprinting down the stairs. I finally caught up to her in the backyard. She told me that he was a Russian, and he just nodded at her. She refused to go anywhere near my attic ever again. She spent the night in the tent in the backyard and got my mom to drive her home early the next morning. After dropping my friend off at her place, my mother looked at me and told me that they're not imaginary friends. She tried to convince herself that they were, but that all changed when she saw my father in the hallway, just staring at her. Years after he died, she yelled at him to go away, and he just left and went back into his room, the same room he passed away in. Fast forward a few years again, me and my mother are still living there, and I still don't know what's wrong with that house, but let's just say, once I inherit it, it's going straight back to the bank, because if they really were ghosts, what do those guys in the attic really want? Even though they seemed harmless and like they were looking out for me, how can I really be sure? Why did Sasha all of a sudden appear to my friend when I'd been dreaming about him for years and I'd never seen him? Why didn't he say anything? Why did he just nod and then fade away? Every time I go up in the attic, I feel as I'm being watched now. It doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel safe. Even when I'm in my room, I still hear footsteps and voices coming from the attic, trying to lure me back up there. Even voices that sound like my father, calling me, urging me to come upstairs. As much as I want to go up and see if it really is him, I'm not falling for it. I haven't been, and I will not go back in that attic. I just have to keep telling myself that a few more years and this house will be mine. I won't be keeping it. I'll be selling it the first chance I get. It's a money pit. The upkeep is insane, but I'll make sure I leave the ghosts in the attic out of the listing.